Hello and welcome everyone. My name is Jeremy Katz and I'm the Senior Director of Archives at the William Breman Jewish Heritage Museum in Atlanta, Georgia. Thank you so much for your interest in our Atlanta Jewish History Talk series presented by the Breman Museum in partnership with the Southern Jewish Historical Society and generously sponsored by Marilyn Ginsburg Eckstein. Over the course of the next 6 weeks, we will be discussing Atlanta's Jewish history in depth with the most respected scholars in their respective topics. Now, this series was inspired by the release of The Jewish Community of Atlanta by yours truly, and the is now available for sale and features 200 images that document the rich community history of our community. Now, the vast majority of these images come from the archives at the Breman Museum, and all royalties, authors' royalties, benefit the museum's operations. We will be providing a link where you can purchase the book, as well as the books written by our distinguished speakers today, in our chat, as well as in the follow-up email that will be sent to registered participants after the program. Now, the follow-up email will also include a link to a survey. Please take a few minutes to fill out the survey. The information that you give us helps the museum request invaluable grant funding, as well as assist us in improving future programs. Speaking of which, a link of future programs offered by the Breman Museum will also be included in this follow-up email as well. Please know that we encourage questions and will dedicate time at the end of the program to answer questions from the audience. So please utilize the chat and Q&A feature. Now, without further delay, it's my pleasure to welcome the Executive Director of the Breman Museum, Leslie Gordon, who will introduce our speakers for today.
Thank you, Jeremy. I'm Leslie Gordon. I'm the Executive Director here at the Breman, and it gives me my pleasure, it's my great pleasure to introduce our speakers. Steve Oney is the author of And the Dead Shall Rise, The Murder of Mary Fagan and the Lynching of Leo Frank. The book received the American Bar Association Silver Gavel Award and the National Jewish Book Award. He's also the author of A Man's World, a gallery of fighters, creators, actors, and desperados, a collection of magazine articles drawn from his long career writing for GQ, Esquire, Los Angeles, the Atlanta Journal, and Constitution Magazine, Time, and other publications. He's presently working on a history of NPR for Simon & Schuster. Steve Oney was raised in Atlanta and educated at the University of Georgia and at Harvard, where he was a Nieman and a Shorenstein Fellow. He lives in Los Angeles with his wife, designer Madeline Stewart. Sandra Berman was the founding archivist of the Cleveland Jewish Archives at the Western Reserve Historical Society. After moving to Atlanta, Berman became the founding archivist of the Joseph and Ida Pearl Cuba Archives for Southern Jewish History at the Breman Museum, which was then the Jewish Community Archives and operating out of a closet at the Atlanta Jewish Federation. During her 28-year tenure, Berman grew the archives into the largest repository for Jewish history in the region and co-curated multiple exhibitions at the Breman Museum. A major collecting area Berman focused on was the Leo Frank case. And now I'll turn it over to our moderator, Sandy Berman.
Thank you, Leslie. And thank you, Jeremy. And welcome, Steve. It's so good to see you after all these years.
Thank you all.
It was a long time ago already that you kept showing up at the Breman to do research, and we got to talk about the Leo Frank case on a regular basis. I wanted to begin by asking you about your recent op-ed. And if any of you have not seen it, it appeared on January 18th in the Washington Post. It's a great op-ed. Please pull it up if you can. And in that article, you address the John Ossoff election, the fact that he is, well, not the first Southern Jewish senator, but certainly the first from Georgia, and how the atmosphere and the joy that was spread throughout the Jewish community because of that election. And you compared that to the atmosphere that was going on 116 years ago when Leo Frank was lynched. Certainly the demographics of Atlanta has changed over the years. Many people don't even know who Leo Frank was. But at the same time, there's obvious excitement and a thrill for the Jewish community that a young Jewish man was elected to the United States Senate. When you look back at the difference between what was going on then and what is happening now, how would you compare the two time periods? And also, do you feel that that virulent anti-Semitism that happened 116 years ago could rear its ugly head again after events like Charlottesville and the like?
Well, that's a good question. Several questions in one. Um, Atlanta's always had an assimilated Jewish community. And from the beginning, as Jeremy's book points out, Atlanta Jews have felt at home in the South and have been part of the city's power structure. And in some ways, the Leo Frank lynching was an aberration. However, it's an aberration that I think could occur again. I don't think history repeats itself, but I think echoes can be heard over the ages. Now, John Ossoff's victory is incredible compared to the atmosphere of 1915 when Leo Frank was lynched. You would have never thought a Jewish man could be elected senator from Georgia. The thing that struck me, though, is that on the January 6th riot in Washington, D.C., I couldn't help but think about how Atlanta responded when Governor John Slayton commuted Leo Frank's death sentence in June of 1915. And I know I'm throwing a lot of information at people, but the Leo Frank case had become a huge cause célèbre. The governor of Georgia, John Slayton, commuted his sentence. And the next morning, a mob marched on the state capitol, took over the state capitol, tried to break into Slayton's office. And then later that day, a mob of thousands marched up Peachtree Street to Slayton's home, which was at Slayton Road and Peachtree Street in Buckhead. And it was only a miracle that no one was killed. So the parallels really seemed so precise, actually. And I think there is a great deal of dislocation in our world right now, as there was when Leo Frank was lynched. There's this spread of false information, disinformation, and that's another direct parallel to the Leo Frank case. The New York Times took up the Leo Frank case in 1914 and 1915 and advocated for Frank's innocence and for his exoneration. And the state of Georgia had a newspaper called the Jeffersonian, run by Tom Watson from rural Georgia outside of Augusta. And he took it upon himself every week to rebut the New York Times and to present an entirely different version of the facts that pointed to Leo Frank's guilt. So when you have disinformation being spread and believed, I think it's a very ripe climate for anti-Semitism. And when you also have a society that is changing, shifting, uncertain of where it fits, you have the same thing. So I don't think these hostilities are in any way dead. I think it's a fire that has been tamped down for 100 years, but you can still see the embers, and in some places you can see the flames.
Thank you. I agree. You also mentioned in your article something that we discussed many years ago, because it resonated with me, and I know it resonated with you, and that was Lucille Frank's burial and how that actually happened. It didn't take place till many years after she died, and I was hoping you could address that for the audience today.
Well, on my piece about John Ossoff, some people may have thought this was a stretch. I opened it up with a scene of Lucille Frank's burial. And Lucille Frank died in 1957. She was not buried until 1964. Her ashes, she'd been cremated. They sat at the funeral home, and finally her nephews, the Marcus brothers, buried her in a private ceremony under the cover of darkness in an unmarked plot between her parents' graves at Oakland Cemetery. And they did this because they were terrified, even 50 years after Leo Frank's lynching, to have a public burial. And I found this out from Alan and Fanny Marcus. Journalism is never a guaranteed way to live. You go out on a job, and I flew down to St. Petersburg, Florida, just to talk to Alan and Fanny. No idea what they would tell me. And suddenly over lunch, they're telling me this story of Alan and his brother burying Lucille with garden tools. And a light bulb went off in my head. I had a couple of reactions. One, it was a very emotional story. And two, it was a very revealing story. The revelation was that 50 years later, Atlanta's Jews were still so traumatized by the Leo Frank lynching. And that, for me, was a picture of the repression and the denial that afflicted Atlanta's Jewish community in the wake of the Frank lynching. And that for members of the temple, members of the original group, family members, friends who were close to Leo Frank at the time, it still wasn't over half a century later. So that's what I opened the piece in the Post with, that, because I thought the comparison 50 years on again to the atmosphere when John Ossoff was elected, which was public and triumphant, was so different than this sad scene at Oakland Cemetery, which was furtive and private and fearful. And the thing for me, when Fanny and Alan Marcus told me the story, the writing of the Leo Frank book was a long haul for me, and that was pretty early in my research. And I tucked it away in my heart and said, no matter what, I have to get this book done just so I can tell that story.
Well, you just mentioned that the writing of the Leo and the Dead Shall Rise was a long haul for you. 18 years, I think.
Close to it.
Close to it. 18 years of research, constantly uncovering, unearthing stories. Can you address some of those real surprises, those astonishing moments, or those revelations that occurred? Some of the most interesting to you and part of the book.
Well, first, I don't recommend anyone out there listening spending 18 years on anything unless it's their Major League Baseball career. But the part of the reason it took so long is because it's a big, complicated case. And I wrote a long story for Esquire magazine in 1985 when Alonzo Mann, who'd been a witness in the Frank trial, came forth very late in his life to say he'd hidden a piece of important evidence and wanted to talk about it before his death. It was the equivalent of a deathbed confession. And I flew to Tennessee to interview Alonzo at a veterans hospital. And that was the basis for my Esquire story, which was a pretty thorough story. But after the story ran, I realized I didn't know very much about the Frank case at all. I knew enough to support a magazine piece, but not a book. So I dove into the deep end and tried to immerse myself fully in the case, in the trial, in the evidence against Leo Frank, in the evidence for Leo Frank, in the atmosphere of Atlanta at that time. Probably the biggest two mysteries are who killed Mary Fagan and who lynched Leo Frank. When I tell people about the book, I say it's a double murder mystery and a social history. But I'm going to talk briefly about getting to the bottom of the lynching of Leo Frank. The lynching of Leo Frank was essentially a perfect crime. Leo Frank was abducted from the state prison, which was then in Milledgeville, driven in the dead of night from Milledgeville to Marietta, a stone's throw from the Big Chicken on Highway 41, and lynched at dawn on August 17th, 1915. And no one involved was prosecuted. No one involved suffered anything at all except a lost night's sleep and maybe some pangs to the conscience of a few of these men later in their lives. And their names were never reported. The whole thing was covered up. And having gone to the University of Georgia and having a sense of how Georgia works, I realized that that could not have happened unless there was tremendous political leverage and financial wherewithal. You couldn't pull something off like that. Now, I must say there were 22 lynchings in Georgia in 1915. The other 21 victims were Black. Most of those lynchings, however, were county affairs, spontaneous. The lynchings occurred within a day or two of the alleged crime that the victim committed. The Leo Frank lynching was a coldly calculated venture that saw the lynch party brethren, as I call them in the book, leverage the political system and spring Leo Frank from the prison. So I really went to school on it. I spent a lot of time with a man named Bill Kinney, who was the associate editor of the Marietta Journal. Bill's uncle had been in the lynch party. And to bring this all home to you and give you a sense of how linked into the power structure these people were, Bill's uncle, Cicero Dobbs, was the grandfather of the wife of Governor Roy Barnes. So he was just a foot soldier in the lynch group. But I went back and forth to Bill. I must have interviewed Bill 25 times, and he almost never gave me a direct answer to a question because Bill knew most of what had happened, but it was a very uneasy inheritance for him. But he countenanced my pesky questions and kept asking me other questions, kept saying, well, why don't you go talk to so-and-so? Why don't you look into this, see this relationship? Simultaneously, I read all the society columns from the 3 Atlanta daily papers at the time to ascertain what the power structure was in Marietta, what people ate dinner together. These were great stories. There were always guest lists for every dinner party or every social, and you began to see who ran Marietta. And I learned the name of this one lynch party planner, Herbert Clay, who was the son of a United States Senator from Georgia, Alexander Stevens Clay. And I flew down to Sarasota, Florida to meet Herbert's son, Eugene Herbert Clay Jr. And he was a lawyer in Sarasota. And I walked into his office. We'd been corresponding and talking on the phone. And with choking back sobs, he said, yes, my father was most likely one of the planners of this lynching. And then Herbert Jr., Gene, he was called, agreed to meet me in Marietta. And we spent a long weekend driving around Marietta, talking to every old person who we could find. I jokingly said I interviewed everyone in Marietta 80 years old or older. And I think it came pretty close. But Herbert wanted to find out about his dad because his mom and dad had gotten divorced when he was quite a young boy and he grew up with his mother. I wanted to find out about the lynching. So we went and spent time with these older people. I also had a very important source who ran the main beauty parlor in Marietta, and many of the wives and daughters of the lynch party members got their hair done by her. And her dad was in the lynch party as well. And she was quite an independent-minded woman and realized that this was a terrible wrong. And she shared with me almost everything she knew about the relationships of these families. I talked to 3 people who were actually at the lynching. They didn't see Frank die, but they were there in the crowd afterwards. And I felt by the end of this was a lengthy enterprise to canvass all these people and to get to the bottom of the newspaper accounts. But by the end, I felt I had a really good sense of who did it, why they did it, how they did it. And if anything, I went a little easy on Marietta. I left out the names of anyone who I had doubts about. I just included the core group that I knew was responsible. There were others who were involved. There may even have been a few mercenaries who were hired. It was 7 or 8 powerful Mariettans who planned it. They ran it through the state legislature, and about 25 people who carried it out.
And when you confronted or spoke to any of these individuals, were you ever fearful? Was there any anger involved in these interviews?
Surprisingly not. I approached this very respectfully. I said, I want to understand. I'm not here to castigate. I'm in the business of trying to understand what happened. Now, there were some people who lied to me. There were sons and daughters who were still protecting their parents' reputations, but I never had anyone threaten me. Now, having gone to high school in Atlanta, I thought, wow, there were lynch party members still alive when I was in high school. What would that have been like to actually talk to some of these people? And would the degree of threat have been different? It might have been okay in the 1970s when I was in high school, but in the 40s or 50s, if you'd brought this up to someone, someone would have told you to leave this alone at the least. But by the 1980s and 90s, when I did my research, everyone was quite kind. In fact, the only pushback I really got doing this book was from older members of Atlanta's Jewish community who didn't want to get into it, and who were in some ways reflecting the same attitude that Alan and Fanny Marcus told me about when they buried Lucille. This was something best kept under wraps, and the less said about it, the better. Now my turn to ask you a question, Sandy. You are an obsessive after my own heart, and you did your own deep dive and dig into this. And tell us about some of the thrills and some of your pursuits in finding a National Pencil Company pencil and actually putting together the physical artifacts of a case that had been so long forgotten.
It was a thrill. I felt for all those years that I was the archivist at the Breman, that I was a Leo Frank detective, always searching, always looking for items relating to the case. And when we came across something, it truly was thrilling. I think one of the most exciting moments, well, the pencil is one, but I had to buy that. If you can believe it, there are pencil collectors in this country, and I kept calling them and writing them. And finally, one of them was willing to part with his very rare pencil from the National Pencil Company, because the company went out of business not soon after the lynching. And from what I read, one of the salesmen said that he would, after the lynching, he would go around to different companies to try to sell the pencils, and people would just even break them in front of him because they didn't want to buy any of the pencils from the National Pencil Company. But I was very anxious because, unlike you, I needed to find the objects to make an exhibition. You were looking for the research to tell the story, and your research obviously helped me so much in putting together this exhibition. But you can't make an exhibition without the stuff. You have to be able to tell a visual story. And so we were looking for the things to that related to the Frank case. And for me, finding Leo's family was really the most exciting time for me, because it was difficult. Leo and Lucille had no children, and I didn't really know how to find Leo's family. So what I did was I went and I knew the last name was Stern, and I knew that Leo was buried at Mount Carmel Cemetery in Brooklyn, New York. So I called the cemetery and asked if anyone was taking care of Leo's grave. No one was. And then I said, well, how about Marion Stern, Leo's sister? And surprisingly enough, someone was taking care of her grave, and they gave me the name of her son. I wrote him a letter. The letter came back addressee unknown. I was really frustrated. I then called the Jewish Federation of Brooklyn, New York, and asked if they had a listing for a Robert Stern. They told me that they did, and he had just recently moved to Hilton Head. They gave me his number. I called him up. The first thing his wife said when she answered the phone, and I said, "This is Sandy Berman from the William Breman Jewish Heritage Museum in Atlanta." She answered, "I bet I know why you're calling." And they led me to, we went to Hilton Head and interviewed Robert. It was one of the last interviews he ever gave before he died. And then he put me in touch with other family members, and we ended up with this marvelous collection of Frank family photographs, and his baby shoes, and his baby rattle, and his pin from Cornell. So it was a great find, and really an exciting moment for us. But there were others over the years, but that was probably the most exciting.
That's a good story.
Getting back to your research, something that's always intrigued me, and we spoke about it for years, were the autopsy reports. I know that she was, there were 3 separate reports, I believe. She was exhumed twice. Did any of those, do you think they're still out there? I know you never were able to find those autopsy reports. And do you think that any information is still out there, or was it destroyed, deliberately destroyed, or just misplaced?
That's a hard question. I fear it was just misplaced. However, I hold out some hope. Autopsies were not standard in murder cases in the teens, if you can believe it. And Mary Fagan, even though the victim of a violent crime, she was taken to a funeral home. The coroner did a preliminary examination, and then she was released to the funeral home attendants. She was embalmed and buried. And it was not until 9 days after the murder that the medical authorities in Atlanta realized this was a very volatile case, and they did what is called a field autopsy. She was exhumed in the cemetery in Marietta, and she was given an autopsy in the field. And that autopsy was not sufficient, and she was exhumed again. It became ghoulish, but when you look into the history of criminal investigations of that time, not all that unusual. The rumor was that her body had been mutilated, that there were bite wounds, and that this was all kept quiet. Another thing to understand, people were just as sexual, as violent, as complex then as they are now. But in the public discourse, these things weren't discussed. So whether Mary Fagan was raped or not, we don't really know. In fact, the word rape was not used in a newspaper. The newspaper accounts would say outraged, that would be the euphemism, or the crime that was presumed to have preceded the murder, a mouthful like that. So we don't know exactly what happened to Mary Fagan. As for the chain of evidence, how these documents were preserved, up until the late 1940s, Hugh Dorsey was still alive. He was the prosecutor in the Leo Frank case, and he had a big file cabinet in his office, and he said it's all in there. And he died, and his son James took custody of this. James Dorsey committed suicide in the 1960s, and in the aftermath of that, the family lost track of what they had. And I spoke extensively to James's son, Jazz, he's called James Jr., who lives in Nashville, and he had no idea what had happened to it. He assumed it had been thrown away. But the transcript of the actual transcript of the Frank trial is missing. It was numbered into the thousands of pages, stood about 5 feet high. It was existent in the 1960s at the Fulton County Courthouse. Someone stole it. I don't think they would have thrown it away. To steal it would have been like breaking out of a prison. You would have had to have taken 100 pages at a time. And, I keep my eyes open even now, thinking that maybe some of this stuff will turn up. But, there, as you know, it's a fishing expedition. Sometimes you're lucky, sometimes you're not.
Do you think that the autopsy reports, if they were found, would be the definitive way to say who actually did murder Mary Fagan? Do you think that
maybe not? There was a reporter at the Atlanta Constitution in the 1920s who saw the autopsy report and also saw Leo Frank's dental x-rays, he later wrote. And he made a layman's assessment that the bite marks on Mary Fagan's body didn't match these dental x-rays. He was very enthused by his repertorial discovery and was going to write this story for the Atlanta Constitution, at which point Atlanta's Jewish power structure came down on him and said, don't do this story, and came down on the editor of the Atlanta Constitution, and the story never appeared. And the reason behind that action, specifically by a lawyer named Henry Alexander, was that you could bring back proof positive that Leo Frank was innocent of the murder of Mary Fagan, and people would not believe it. It would be so-called fake news, and it would not be enough to, in the public mind, establish his innocence. It would just stir things back up. And again, I think that's one of the parallels between then and now. If you pollute the body of knowledge, the consensus about the facts in a community or in a country, you come close to destabilizing the place and discouraging an ability to have a conversation about. Instead, you're talking at people as opposed to talking with people. And the Leo Frank case became one of those polarizing incidents in which it was impossible to find consensus. And people who believe Leo Frank is guilty still cling to that view. And, you know, there was a case against Leo Frank. He was admittedly the last person to see Mary Fagan alive. It doesn't make him the killer, but he'd be a suspect even today. And you add that suspicion to the very volatile nature of his business. The National Pencil Company was not a little fly-by-night operation. It was a big industrial concern in downtown Atlanta that manufactured hundreds of thousands of pencils a week, and the workforce was almost entirely teenage girls. So you have a management force at the factory of well-educated young men, and then you have a workforce of flirtatious 13, 14, 15-year-old girls, and it's a recipe for disaster. Because if something does happen, the parents in Atlanta at that time, were the parents of these working girls were upset that they were so impoverished they had to send their kids off to the mill or the factory to work. So it was a tinderbox of potential for violence, and it all exploded when Mary Fagan was found murdered there.
So after all those years of research and writing and finally get the book published, did you have withdrawal pains from leaving it, putting it aside, or have you ever really put it aside?
I've kind of put it aside. I'm working on another book. I went off and did what I have done my entire career, went back to writing magazine stories and wrote a lot of them in the years since the book was published. So I've moved on, but I can't really forget the Leo Frank case because it is such an extraordinary thing. The reason I wrote the book was I thought the Leo Frank case illuminated all of life in the South at the moment that it happened, that you could see the class divisions, the racial divisions. It had sex, it had violence, it had deeper meanings about where society was going. And I still feel that way. Most of the time we live in our life in a kind of fog. We don't see things clearly. The Leo Frank case illuminated everything in Atlanta for the couple of years that it happened. And it laid bare the hostilities and the divisions. And I was fascinated by it. And, Atlanta has now changed greatly. Atlanta in 1915 was a city, but it was a small city. And it was also geographically very contained. The Atlanta of 1915 was more like Boston or San Francisco. Everything was close in. Buckhead was out in the country. And you get farther north, you were in deep farming territory in Gwinnett County or elsewhere. Now Atlanta is a city of sprawl and dispersal, and you don't really know who your neighbors are, and there are people from everywhere. In 1915, it was a very intimate place. So a murder like the murder of Mary Fagan illuminated all of it, and you could see it all. And no, I've never really put it behind me, just because it's so interesting. It really is interesting.
Well,
and let me ask you, did you put, after your obsessive years putting the exhibit together, did you put it behind you?
Somewhat. Again, similar to your experience. Even after we put the exhibit together, I kept looking. Even today, I still go online, I check out eBay, I type in the name Mary Fagan, I type in the name Leo Frank, just to see if anything comes up. I discovered after we put the exhibition together, I actually found a glass slide of the funeral, of the internment of Frank, which we never put in the exhibition, but it was a great, addition to the collection. Jeremy recently found the keys to the prison from somebody who, a family member whose grandfather worked there. So no, it doesn't really ever go away. It was the excitement of locating new things. I mean, when I went up to New York along with the then director of the museum, Jane Levy, we went up to New York to look at Ada Fox's papers. And that was another discovery, that it was just an amazing treasure trove of information. The only known picture that I could ever find of Jim Conley. And I know this isn't on the list or our discussion of questions, but I have another question I'd like to ask you real quickly. So many people have tried to find out what happened to Jim Conley in later life. Since you've written the book, has anything come to light about his last years? I know he was in and out in prison for a while, or where he's buried, anything.
Jim Conley was the key witness against Leo Frank, a Black guy with a bad reputation and a pretty long criminal record. And the criminal record was both before the murder of Mary Fagan and after the murder of Mary Fagan. He served 1 year as an accessory in the Mary Fagan murder. He was Leo Frank's admitted accomplice and then testified against Frank. Essentially, he disappeared. And I traced him as best I could. He lived in the Vine City neighborhood, which is near where Mercedes-Benz Stadium is now. And I walked those streets trying to find older people who might have known him. I got preachers in some of the Vine City churches to bring together their elder citizens groups. I could talk to them. I did find one guy who knew him in the 1940s. I will say, I don't want to sound mysterious, but there is someone who's got a lead on where Jim Conley ended up. And this guy's working on a project, and I'm encouraging him, and maybe within the next year or two, he will be able to come forth with what he's found. So there is someone out there still looking for Jim, but Jim basically just disappeared. And he was a cagey guy. He was not gonna let the police find him anyway. And he was, he knew what it took to survive as a Black man in Atlanta in the teens through the 50s. And what it took to survive was to keep a low profile.
It's always intrigued me, and I know it's even intrigued the Jewish Genealogical Society and the Black Genealogical Society even got together at one point to try to see if they could do any work on Conley and his family, and I think they came up with nothing. So it would be great to find out if we could find out what did happen to him.
There's no death certificate at the state archives, and as far as I know, there's no headstone with his name on it. Someone suggested to me that I start going through local cemeteries, the kind of cemeteries that are behind Black churches, and looking for a headstone. But that seemed like such a impossible task that I just didn't do it. But I think this guy who I know who's got a lead on him, I think he might actually have something.
Well, I'd love to hear if it comes true. I'd like to end by and open it up for questions by just adding that in 2019, Fulton County District Attorney opened up a cold case on Leo Frank. I don't know if they've come up with anything as of yet, but again, we'll be waiting to hear and see if any new information comes forward. So now I think we can open it up for questions from the audience.
Thank you both, Sandy and Steve, for your insightful questions and comments. We have received a number of questions from the audience, and I'm going to start posing those to you in the time that we have remaining. One was about the Conviction Integrity Unit. I did find an article from late last year that they received a federal grant. So we'll, like Sandy said, we'll see. I know there's a number of cases that they're looking into, the cases that have kind of haunted the state over the years. The first question we have is, did either of you work with Alfred Urey in the connection of his musical Parade?
For me, I'm sorry, Steve, he visited the archives on several occasions, looked at some material, but other than that, we really didn't work with him that closely, although he did visit and look to see what we had, just to get a visual idea. And when the local productions would come in, they would want to come in and look at the photographs of Lucille and Leo and other people within the case so that they could get a feel for the characters they were projecting.
I did not work with Alfred Drury either, and Alfred and I were really going in different directions. Alfred was mounting a musical and trying to build the dramatic storytelling of a Broadway production. I was looking to find out the facts about the Leo Frank case. However, I did have an incredible moment with Alfred and Jason Robert Brown, who wrote the music for the play, a couple of years ago at the Museum of Jewish Heritage in New York. Alfred, Jason, and I were on stage with several cast members of the play and a small orchestra, and they did numbers from the play. And then Alfred, Jason, and I talked about the facts behind the numbers. And I thought it was a terrific evening, and we worked very well together. And I was very grateful for the opportunity to have that night with Alfred and Jason.
We have a couple of questions about Lucille Seelig and the marriage between her and Leo. Can you all talk about their life before the case and also Lucille's life after the case?
I'll take a stab at it. And there's a connection to Alfred's play. Alfred in Parade works hard to establish a love story between Lucille and Leo. And I see why he did it. However, I'm not sure how strong that love story was in real life. Leo moved down to Atlanta and met Lucille. In fact, met her very quickly because he boarded with Lucille's family in the old Jewish neighborhood down around Turner Field. And he began dating Lucille, and they fell in love and got married in 1909. The bulk of the relationship that you can learn about revolves around the trial of Mary Fagan and the appeals of Leo Frank. And there are a great many letters between them, but most of the letters are very matter of fact. Lucille became the secretary to Leo Frank in his attempts to exonerate himself. And if you check the correspondence of Leo Frank, and it's a voluminous correspondence, at the bottom of every letter, just like a secretary does, you'll see LMF and then LF. She typed his letters. He would dictate them to her, and she would go home at night and type them up. And that was, in some ways, their relationship. I think in later life, Sandy and I talked about this. Lucille moved to Memphis, Tennessee for a while right after the lynching and ran a dress shop in Memphis that was partly owned by her family. She came back to Atlanta and worked at J.P. Allen, which was a very good women's fashion store on Peachtree Street. And her one of her in-laws had the glove and cosmetic concession at J.P. Allen. And Lucille would sometimes have as customers the daughters and wives of men who planned Leo's lynching. And they would come in to shop with Lucille. They didn't know that their fathers or husbands had been involved. She certainly didn't know that their fathers and husbands had been involved, and they would do business together. They would transact sales. And one of Lucille's customers was a woman named Lucille Sugar Morris, whose father, Judge Newton Morris of Marietta, the Superior Court judge of Marietta, was a main planner of the Leo Frank lynching. And I went to interview Lucille Morris one day, and she said, you know, I would shop with Lucille, and she was such a lovely woman, and it was so sad what happened to her. And I felt such emotion for her. And I was somewhat flabbergasted sitting there talking to this woman, thinking, you know, your father killed this Lucille Frank's husband, and unbeknownst to you, you had a business relationship with Leo Frank's widow all these years. And I think that one vignette, like the private burial of Lucille, explains a lot about why Atlanta's Jewish community didn't really want to look into this because it was so intimate that if you started tearing it apart, if you started ripping it up, you would find that the connections were dangerous and close, and it was better not knowing. At least that's what Atlanta's Jews told themselves. And in many ways, Marietta's community of people who were involved in planning the lynching mirrored Atlanta's Jewish community. It was best left unspoken there as well, because it was too volatile, too dangerous.
And I think within the family too, I mean, I became friendly and interviewed Lucille's great niece, and she didn't find out what happened to her uncle till she was in her teens. And she lived with her great aunt for a while. So I think that it was just such a something you just did not talk about. And that was even within the family. And even when I interviewed Robert Stern, he didn't know what happened to Uncle Leo till he was in school himself and saw a headline in a local paper. He had always seen the portrait of his uncle in the house, and they just would say, well, he died. And he didn't know what happened to him until he saw a newspaper article on the anniversary of Leo's death up in Brooklyn. So it just was not talked about.
Well, lynchings were acts of terrorism. They were not only murders, but they were symbolic. They always sent a signal to someone. And the lynching of Leo Frank was very particularly an act of terrorism. It was so well orchestrated, and then that the lynch party hung Leo Frank within sight of Lucille or Mary Fagan's ancestral home. This was meant to send a message to the entire state and to the entire world. This was a message that resonated in New York and all throughout the country. And in fact, one of the poignant things I think in my book is the New York Times took up this case and took it up really in a way that probably hurt Leo Frank. They wrote too much about it. But within days of the Leo Frank lynching, Adolph Ochs, the owner and publisher, dropped the case. It was, and the New York Times essentially said nothing about it ever again because they realized the potency of this story. And the editor of the Macon Telegraph, who was a strong anti-lynching progressive, sent Adolph Ochs a note saying, you know, if you keep this up, it's going to get worse.
I want to jump in and ask another follow-up question to that, because we're getting some questions about Alonzo Mann and the whole effort to pardon and addressing guilt or innocence. We're getting a lot of questions about that. Can you all chime in about kind of the period before Alonzo Mann came forward, the period after, these efforts by ADL and others to receive a posthumous pardon?
I'm going to let Steve address that. He actually interviewed Alonzo Mann, so he's best able to answer that question.
You know, there were thanks, Sandy, two pardon applications. First, in 1982, the lawyers Wittenstein and Schwartz asked for a complete pardon. The Georgia Board of Pardon and Paroles held hearings. Those hearings somewhat mimicked the Leo Frank trial, as people on both sides of the case weighed in and expressed themselves, and the Board of Pardon and Paroles denied the pardon application. Dale Schwartz and Charles Wittenstein reapplied. They narrowed the scope of the application. They merely asked for the state to apologize for not protecting Leo Frank. I didn't say that, but that's in essence what they asked. And in 1986, the state said we failed to protect Leo Frank's constitutional rights by not protecting him at the state prison, and we were in error. But they never passed on Leo Frank's guilt or innocence. And the reaction in Atlanta at the time was, Leo Frank is obviously innocent, and this was a failure of courage and will on the part of the State Pardon and Parole Board. I think, in truth, when you looked at the evidence that they were able to examine, it would be very difficult to have fully pardoned Leo Frank just on Alonzo Mann's late in life account. Now, I'm convinced that Alonzo was telling the truth, that he saw what he saw. He was the office boy to Leo Frank. He was working there the day Mary Fagan was killed. He'd run out of the office, realized he forgot something, ran back in, and there in the lobby, he saw Jim Conley holding Mary Fagan's body. And he said Jim Conley told him, "If you tell anyone about this, I'll kill you." And Alonzo was 14, he was shy, had a stutter. His parents didn't want him to get involved. He stifled this for most of his life. And then in his 80s, he told the story. The fact that Jim Conley was holding Mary Fagan's body, the lawyers would say, well, the prosecution said he was holding her body as well, because Leo Frank had solicited Jim Conley as his accomplice to help him get rid of the body. The only thing new that this really added was Leo Frank, or the prosecution said that they had transported Mary Fagan's body in the elevator at the factory. And if that was the case, Jim Conley would never have been in the lobby with it, because the crime was presumed to have occurred up higher in the building. So it was incredibly dramatic, and I'm very grateful that I met Alonzo Mann, and through him, in a sense, knew Leo Frank, knew Jim Conley, knew the principals in this case. But it was a narrow reed to try to build a posthumous pardon application on.
Sandy, do you have anything to add about that? I know you were with the exhibition, you talked about Alonzo Mann and just creating the exhibition. How did you address guilt, innocence, pardon, all of that information?
For the purpose of the exhibition, it was our goal to really just present the facts of the case. It was up to the visitor then. I mean, as a history museum, we could not have a particular point of view. We had to just present the facts of the case. And as the visitors would walk through the exhibition and they looked at all of the newspaper headlines and the court reports and all of the other items and documents and photographs that we had, it was up to them to draw a conclusion at the end. I agree with Steve. The pardon, there was never a point where they could actually say that he was totally innocent, because there was no evidence to actually support that in the end.
We've also gotten a couple of questions about the Jewish community in Atlanta before the lynching and after the lynching, and the aftermath that we're still feeling today. And we're seeing a lot of the similar patterns of disinformation, fake news, of yellow journalism, and it led to death. Then somebody in the chat mentioned the Capitol riots a couple of weeks ago, and the death that took place there. I'd love to hear your opinions on how the Jewish community, both before the lynching, after the lynching, and the aftermath that we're still feeling today, especially with the Ku Klux Klan and the ADL being formed around that time.
Well, I can probably address the question of before the lynching in the sense that everything we've ever collected, everything that we have in the archives, the Jewish community felt very well accepted within the greater Atlanta community, especially the German Jewish community. They were involved, perhaps not socially, but politically, economically, with the greater Atlanta community. One of the founders of the Piedmont Driving Club, Aaron Haas, was Jewish. There weren't any members after that for a very long time. And even in 1916, only a year after the lynching, Victor Kriegshaber, who was the owner of Atlanta Terracotta Works, was appointed president of the Chamber of Commerce. So prior to the lynching and the Frank case, the Jewish community really felt a sense of security. They felt that they were part of the greater Atlanta community. And I'll leave it up to Steve to talk about the aftermath.
Well, the aftermath was that Atlanta's Jewish community, as the couple of incidents I've related, became more insular and less open about their Jewishness. This was especially true at the temple, where Rabbi David Marks prohibited the use of a huppah at weddings, stopped the playing of a number of traditional Jewish songs, and, you know, he retreated. And I was lucky enough to find a number of his letters and quote them in my book. As that relates to our present moment, again, I say, when the riot occurred at the United States Capitol on January 6th, I immediately flashed to the riot at Georgia's Capitol the morning after Governor Slayton commuted Frank's death sentence. And there are some strong parallels. And the mob in Atlanta in 1915 numbered in the thousands. They ran over a couple of police barricades on their way out to Buckhead to try to get Governor Slayton. And luckily, it's a 6-mile walk from 5 Points, where the mob organized, to Buckhead, and Slayton called out the National Guard, and the National Guard was arriving there at the same time that the mob did, and they didn't get into the governor's mansion. However, most importantly, Tom Watson is one of the fabulous, contradictory, difficult personalities in Georgia history. And his reaction to the commutation in his newspaper, the Jeffersonian, was essentially to grant permission to the mob to lynch Leo Frank. And it's hard to understand in today's culture the power of the printed word on newspaper. And Tom Watson's weekly Jeffersonian had tripled in circulation due to his aggressive coverage of the Frank case. And in his first post-commutation issue of the Jeffersonian, he said, by commuting Leo Frank's sentence, the governor of Georgia has destroyed the law, and it's time to take the law into our own hands and to take back what is rightfully ours. And I can almost quote it verbatim, in a moment like this, who's to say that lynch law is not better than no law at all? So Watson declared an assault on the forms of government, in many ways similar to what Donald Trump did in his talk on the morning of January 6th before the mob took off for the Capitol. And when you're in a time where there's a great dispute about the facts, you know, I love Daniel Moynihan's famous comment about how you can have a different opinion, but you can't have a different set of facts. But in the Frank case, there was a different set of facts, just like there is today. And that greatly destabilizes society and allows for freelancers to take their own actions. And I fear that's where we are again. And the lynching of Leo Frank was a precursor to that. It's a foreshadowing of that, what happens when that kind of thinking takes hold in a society.
And I just want to say add one more point. When we were researching for the exhibition and we went up to the New York Times and looked at the publisher Adolph Fox's papers, we actually found a letter that was written from his niece to him, saying that the Jewish community of Atlanta met. 100 of the most prominent men met at the club, which we can only imagine was probably the Standard Club, and decided as a group that they would do nothing to confront the lynchers or try to bring the mob to justice because they were too fearful. So the whole community, it was a consensus among the members of the Jewish community. We have to stay quiet. We can't do anything about this because they were fearful.
Well, this one writer for the Constitution, a guy named Pierre Van Passen, who discovered what he thought were the very illuminating dental x-rays and photographs of bite wounds on Mary Fagan's body. He wrote in his memoirs, he did this in 1923 when he was working at the Constitution, that his car he was driving in downtown Atlanta as he was working on the story, and someone roared up next to him and tried to push his car into an oncoming trolley train. And he took it as a death threat from Atlanta's Jewish community to stay away from the Leo Frank case. And he was scared by it and did drop it.
This is such a fascinating conversation, but we're at time. I want to thank both Steve and Sandy. I think it's so fitting that the series was kicked off by my predecessor alongside an ardent friend of the Breman Museum. And I hope that you all can join us again next week as we discuss Jewish women activists in the region with Mark Bauman, Leonard Rogoff, and Diane Vecchio. Until then, stay safe and healthy, everyone. Take care. Thanks for joining.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.